All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on CSRD-Ready, where we're going to take a deeper look into the CO2 emissions calculation within Qargo. And I'm joined today by Javier from Handico, who's going to talk a little bit more on their implementation of the emissions reporting with Qargo TMS. My name is Bref Ruben. I'm a backend team lead for the engineering team at Qargo. I've been working very closely on the CO2 emissions feature in Qargo from its inception to the implementation of the feature. And I'll be guiding you through the details of how this feature works. But first, Javier, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Brett. Of course. Welcome, everybody. As he has said, my name is Javier. I'm at the moment the head of digital development for both Handico Tracking and Vitos Bat Logistics. And I've been at the moment in charge of arranging the CO2 reporting that we are using at Handico at the moment, which is fully based off the data and the module that Qargo released. So just to tell a bit more of the experience, how everything went from our side, and what can maybe you do as well with the same information.
All right, cool. Thanks, Javier. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover today. First off, why should you actually care? Why do these CO2 emissions matter now? Why are they coming a little bit more to the foreground as opposed to a couple of years ago? And then let's take a look at what's specifically going to change for logistics, because it's relevant, of course, for all industries. But as a logistics player, it's a little bit different, of course, than when calculating the emissions for, let's say, a chemical plant. And then, of course, how those emissions are calculated in detail, also within Qargo, but also how you could calculate them on your own. And of course, it's not just all talk. We're going to show some stuff as well on how it's actually running in the application today. But then you don't really have to take my word for it, because Javier will also go into a little bit more detail on how they have implemented it at their site and how they are using it live day to day. Okay, so as I've mentioned, sustainability is really no longer optional. About a staggering 8% of the total emissions emitted globally, according to sources, is really done by freight transportation alone. So that's really the trucks that are hitting the road. And then if you look at logistics in a broader space, so if you include all of the person's transportation, trains, the aviation, then you amount to about 24%. So it's really a super big amount that we are talking about. And across all industries, you really notice that customers are demanding ever more transparency to be able to make a conscious decision on which option or product that they are going for, so that they can choose for the most sustainable option there. So you really notice as of a couple of years that you can get a competitive advantage through sustainability, being the more sustainable option amongst the products. And this is no different for logistics as well. And if that wasn't enough on the economic side, then you also have governments that are introducing newer regulations for mandatory reporting. Today, we're going to look a little bit more into how the European Union is enforcing that, but there are also incentives outside of the European Union. In the US, in the UK, we are seeing the same things. I'm sure, Javier, that you've experienced that as well.
I mean, frankly speaking, these days it's hard to tell. A few years back, of course, you heard the talk. And obviously, if you want to help to some degree, give your own grain of salt, you wanted to do something about it. But these days, it's not anymore of how much as a company do you want to help, but it's just a mandatory requirement at this stage. As you said, not even just regulations, but we're also talking of becoming part of the procurement process. And now with the whole CSRD and with the intensity metrics that we will see later on, these can be used as KPIs in order to directly compare across the different vendors and be part of the selection process, which means if you don't have anything to measure it in the first place, you're out of the game. And the next step is, if you've measured it, how are you ranking? That is pretty much the environment that we're moving to and towards at this stage. And no company is able to ignore it at this stage. We have to continue.
So you've already encountered this as well when customers ask you for your services.
That's correct. I mean, I would say that at the moment, we still expect it to be more than it currently is. But we've already had a couple of clients asking not only for the report of even the previous year, which at the stage we still didn't even have it, right? But also on the metrics, what are you guys currently doing for it, as well as with different ISOs and certifications to try to attest of what actions are being taken and what are you doing all together. So it's a part of the playing field.
Yeah. It's also what we have noticed when implementing this feature, that it's also driven by the demands from other logistics players, where it's either first from an operational perspective when you're taking the orders, but also on an ongoing basis that these reports are becoming more and more relevant. So let's take a look at the regulatory landscape that is actually influencing this decision. Here, the big move that has happened the past couple of years is the introduction of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive by the European Union, which is a regulation that you can see a little bit as the financial reporting, but then for sustainability. So it's not just sustainability on an ecological side, so not just the CO2 emissions, but also the social aspects of it. But we're going to focus more on the ecological side of things here. The CSRD really tells the companies, okay, here we need to report on ecological data, so the CO2 emissions that we are doing, a little bit like the financial reporting. Think of the general accounting, method, so the GAAP way of reporting, and it sets out how you need to calculate those things and how you need to present them to the regulators on a yearly basis. They work together here based on the GLEC framework. That's GLEC standing for the Global Logistics Emissions Council, which has set out a framework on how to calculate emissions specifically for the logistics industries. For other industries, if you're a manufacturer, there are of course other frameworks that you can use for those emissions that can then be used for the CSRD. So although they are two different entities, they are closely working together in order to provide standardized reporting and regulations. And this also makes sense for the European Union to work in that way because the GLEC framework is a global framework. So it's also something that's being supported by other countries to support all of those emissions and standardized way of working.
From our side, I think it's for the best. Until a few years ago, whenever you were talking with different companies about what your emissions are and whatnot, everybody was having their own individual measure. It was extremely complicated to be able to just match up with all the different parties and be like, hey, I got this, you got that, that's the minute. Right? There were too many different rules to measure it by. And the fact that we now have something that is standardized just makes it so much simpler for every single player to just know what to look at. You don't need translations. Let's do like that.
Yeah, indeed. And even with the standardization, I've really noticed when I go into conversations with customers that it's still quite difficult to really see now how do these calculations actually work behind the scenes. And I think that the industry can really benefits from a standardized solution that already does it for you. Of course, there is also the risk involved with these regulations of missed contracts, reputational damage, and then especially the non-compliance penalties, given the scope of CSRD, which we're going into. Now, you might be wondering, and I think, Javier, for you as well, you're not really falling under the CSRD already, right?
No, not directly, but yes, indirectly.
Yes, indirectly. All right. And I think you touched upon a great point there, because that indirect play here is really what is driving the demand as far as I can see. And this really comes from the accounting scope. So if we go a little bit deeper into the CSRD regulation, there are different accounting scopes that you need to take into account when doing the report. And if you look at it from the perspective of the regulator, that makes sense, because what they are trying to achieve is to really calculate and report on all of the emissions for your company across the entire value chain of your operations. So you're not just looking from the reporting company at what are we manufacturing or the trips that we are doing for our customers. We're also looking at everything that is being emitted in support of those direct operations. And they do this working with these different. From the scope 1 or the direct emissions, that is the most obvious one to calculate. That's really for a logistics player, the trucks that are hitting the roads, the drivers that are making the kilometers on a daily basis. What is the direct emission of that operation? So that's really where everything gets calculated there. Then the other two, the scope 2 and the scope 3 emissions, are so-called indirect emissions. So that's the other part of the supply chain that goes into supporting those direct operations there. We have the scope 2 indirect emissions, which are the purchased electricity and other energy sources that go into supporting your backbone infrastructure. So that would be electricity or heating for the offices of Handico, for example. So that goes in there. And then you have the scope 3 emissions, which are indirect for both your upstream and your downstream activities. So that would be your suppliers and your subcontractors. So this would mean, for example, the companies that are supplying your trucks with fuel, those would be the scope 3 indirect emissions that you need to take into account. And on the other hand, if you are subcontracting work out, so that would mean you get a transportation order and you can't really do it yourself, you don't have the capacity, so you subcontract it out to another party that you work with, or even taking a ferry across the channel from mainland Europe to the UK, that would be an indirect scope as well. And what CSRD basically says that aside from the direct operations that you need to calculate, you also need to take into account all of these indirect emissions into your reporting as well. And here's really where things get interesting, and that's also, I think, Javier, where the demand is coming from, because if you look at the timeline for the CSRD, that's really where you can really see this come into play. So if we look back in 2023, then CSRD entered into force. That's really when the regulations started to happen. But as you mentioned, Javier, we don't really have to report already. And that makes sense as well, because not every company is treated the same according to that regulation. So first off, starting 2025, the companies that are subject to the non-financial reporting directive, they have to report for the CSRD based on the emissions from 2024. So this year, we'll start to see those first reports rolling in order to provide customers and investors the choice to see a little bit like how sustainable is my favorite company actually doing. But what we notice that even though the other companies also have to start reporting in 2026, 2027, 2029, and I'm sure, Javier, I'm not sure when you guys actually need to report.
I think technically speaking, we would actually fall within the listed SMEs, I believe.
Yeah, so 2027 would be the first year for you to provide official reports. But even though you are working together with other companies that already have to do this reporting according to CSRD. And from the scope 1 and the scope 3 that we have seen before from the CSRD, those companies, you would, as Handico, you would fall in the scope 3 of those companies.
Yeah.
So what the companies that already have to report have as a choice, they can say, okay, we work together with Handico Trucking. We can either, one, give our own estimation and our own calculation on how much Handico is actually emitting, or a much easier option for that company is just ask you, Javier, directly, say, how much emissions were you actually doing for us in subcontracting fashion? And in that way, you really have that dynamic where you already have to make those calculations and provide them back to those customers.
100%. I mean, whenever your bigger customers are the ones that are directly applicable, that fall within the regulations themselves, you're part of the life cycle. So you don't really have much of a choice. And as a customer, what you really want to do for them is as much as possible, right? I want to be your best friend. I can do anything that you need and provide it all. So that doesn't leave you much of a choice if you want to provide a high level of service. And that is exactly where all these companies that don't fall within the direct applicability of the regulation are still at the moment making efforts to comply with it, which, frankly speaking, makes it somewhat easier because it lets you enough time to learn how to do it without being under the threat of the regulatory metrics. So look at the silver lining.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't already get the compliance notice because that's going to be on
Yeah,
the company that you are providing that data for is going to be held accountable for that. But at least you can already get some practice runs going
exactly.
and make sure that it's there. And of course, yeah, it really can make the difference between either getting the contract or not getting the contract. Because of course, for the company that is issuing that contract, if you can provide them with highly accurate emissions data that is already being formatted according to
Yeah,
CSRD, you're really just making their lives easier. So
yeah.
that's where that competitive gain comes from.
Indeed. But remember that that is only the first part as well, right? That of
Yes.
can you provide it? Then okay, that
Mm-hmm.
might lead you more into the door. And then
Yeah.
later on, perhaps not today, but definitely not too far away from
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow, is whenever once you're in the door, okay, who does best? Which of you is
Yeah.
going to also assist us on our work that will provide us with a lower emission in the work that you do for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So let's then take a look at how those emissions are being calculated, shall we?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. All right. So what goes on behind the scenes? And this is really what the GLEC framework sets out for you. So first off, the first thing that you need to determine is the basis on what you're going to calculate those emissions. So that's the input data source. There you have several options according to the GLEC framework. You can say, okay, I really have no clue on how to calculate these emissions, so I'm going to start off from standardized tables. And you really have to see it as it's a large Excel file that just says, if you do transportation from Belgium to Spain, then this is going to be the average emission for you. Of course, as you can imagine, Javier, that's really a very broad sort, and then you're likely going to not have very accurate representation of the emissions. A next step would be to go for model data, and that's to really calculate using a route estimation tool like a Google Maps or PTV or Here Maps to get a bit more of a detailed estimation on this is the route that we're actually going to travel from Belgium to Spain with this type of vehicle, and this is going to give you a certain amount of emissions that is going to be calculated. So that's a bit more granular. And then the holy grail or the primary data according to the GLEC framework, that would be to use the actual fuel consumption and calculate based on that what your emissions are. And here they are kind of incentivizing you as well to also go for the more golden data, the primary data there, although it's much more difficult to attain that data, to collect that all. Because the way of that these standardized tables work is that they are going to be at your disadvantage because they are so broadly speaking applied. They are taking emission factors that are a number of times higher than the actual fuel usage that you would have.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, somehow you have to try to measure that by using indications you are not going to underreport. So that is primarily the reason. So that makes absolute sense. And as you said, it can be more complicated to put everything together as to show the primary data. But there have already been examples in which it happens, as with the BI log that we will discuss later on, in which they kind of put everything together. So might be complicated, definitely not impossible.
Yes, definitely. And I think today, for most companies, it's really a good way to start going with standardized tools, so based on model data, and then move into the actual fuel consumption at a later pace, because that's really going to make the difference. Like we said before, who is doing their best efforts on providing the most accurate emissions data. And that ties into the emission factors also, because the emission factors, you can either, once again, start with a standardized factor that's just going to say, I have an articulated truck and it has a gross vehicle weight rating of 7.5 tons, for example. And that way you can use that with the calculation as a factor. Or you can say, I know exactly how much my truck has actually burned up fuel, and use that as an emission factor instead. So that's, again, where the granularity of the data plays in. Yeah. Then, of course, you have the required steps of that calculation. That's actually rather straightforward once you have that base data available, because it's just a matter of taking the kilometers that the truck has driven, multiplying that with the goods that it was transporting at the moment. So that's the amount of kilometers times the tons of weight that the good is that the truck is actually transporting. Mm-hmm. So that gives you a ton kilometer, which is a weighted version of the distance that has been driven. And then you just multiply that with the emission factor that you use over here, giving you the CO2 emissions there. Again, it's still rather broad because we have CO2, we have other carbon monoxide that's also being emitted, and a bunch of other gases, but they all put this together into a bucket called CO2 equivalents, and that's really what's going to be reported there. And then finally, we need to look a little bit at how we are going to report, how are we going to take those scopes of reporting into account. As I mentioned before, you have your suppliers and your subcontractors. That also needs to be taken into account into that calculation. Sounds rather complicated, right, Javier?
It might, but I also have to say, at least with the tools that we have at hand, once you're on it, fortunately, guys, you definitely make it easier.
All right, great to hear. One of those things in the reporting is the scopes of reporting, as we've mentioned before. And here is where it needs to be applied on an individual basis for those emission calculations. And this is called the emissions basis. And it's split up into 3 different parts. The main one that is the most important one is the well-to-wheel emission, so we speak. And well-to-wheel basically means the entire chain that goes into producing the fuel, getting the fuel into your truck, and then the truck actually burning the fuel to make the deliveries happen. So that's the entire life cycle. So that would be all of the emissions that have actually gone into that. Mm-hmm. But as we've seen with the Scope 1 and the Scope 3 reporting, we actually need to split that one up into a supplier part, the company that is providing the fuel to you, that also amounts to some emissions, and then the actual fuel combustion, which would be you actually burning the fuel to make the delivery. And in that way, that is split up into the well-to-tank emission factor, which is the fuel production and distribution. That would be the Scope 3, because that is supplied to you, but it's still emissions that you need to take into account. And the fuel combustion, which is then the Scope 1, because that's your primary operations from day to day, the actual burning of the fuel. Yeah, exactly. And then that combined together would be the well-to-wheel emissions basis that you use. And depending on how you need to report, you need to take one or all 3 of them into account. If you're looking at your own primary operations, you would typically take the sum, because you need to report on the Scope 3, the Scope 1, and then the well-to-wheel as well. If you were calculating for a subcontractor, you would typically only look at the well-to-wheel emissions basis to calculate those emissions. Yep. Especially if you need to report to a different company, you would be in the Scope 3 of those companies. So then the well-to-wheel becomes the most important one to go about that. So of course, it's really important to have all of that data available so that you can make that decision depending on the party that you need to report to. Mm-hmm. All right. So let's take a little bit a look at the BI-log projects. As Javier have mentioned, we have different ways of calculating that. We have primary data, we have model data, we have default data that we can all take into account. But what if we go all the way? Let's take a look at how that worked. And that was the thesis of the BI-log project. So BI-log standing for Business Intelligence in Logistics, which Qargo has done together with VIL, which is the Flanders Institute for Logistics and Innovation. And it was really to see, can we actually do the CSRD reporting with the emissions calculated based on actual fuel usage? And we did that together with another customer of ours, where we used fuel metrics from Trukcing, so over an entire year, to create that emissions reporting model, and then report according to the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions tracking, which was really aligned with the GLEC framework. And there you could really see into play that working with that primary data also worked in the advantage of that company, because the emissions that were coming out of that were actually lower than what would have been with working with the default data. So there you can really see that incentive come into play. But we've also noticed that data quality and governance is really critical to have reliable sustainability reporting. An example to make that a little bit more tangible is what that company was doing was, for example, one of the lanes that they were working with was on an ongoing basis. And then you really notice, okay, the detailed planning of that lane shouldn't really be done anymore because we can just always assume that it's going from point A to point B. And that data was then missing. So that's what then needed to happen is a cleaning step afterwards to ensure that that was still taken into account accurately for the CO2 emissions. So data quality there is really critical to have accurate reporting, which likely also shows in the dashboards that you are making, Javier.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's what we all working with data see every single day. You can try to do anything you want, but ultimately it all comes based on data quality, what has been imputed, what kind of governance is there in it to try to reduce as much those outliers, those random strings not being validated or things of that kind, right? But I have to say, I did see the project with you guys, and even with those problems, it really paid off really nicely. You put it all together, and it really was a proof of method to show that if you want to put it together, does not matter how complicated it is or how many data sources you might need to put together, the option exists. All you need is a proper system where the data is available, that the quality of the data is sufficient, and to have enough intention and manpower as to put it together once.
Yeah, and it's also really what has formed the basis for us as an inspiration to build out the emissions feature in Qargo as well. So it's really where we went all the way and then saw how we could integrate it tightly within the product that Qargo is providing.
Wow, all right, so I'm excited for this part.
Yeah, enough talk about the theory. Let's see a little bit in practice on what we have actually built right now, shall we? So just to give a little bit of an introduction on what we are actually doing within Qargo, and I'll go into that in a minute. But there's two things that you need to remember here. During your operations, the emissions are actually continuously calculated for you. So every time you plan in a new order, you plan in a new trip, your driver is driving around and we receive more data, Qargo is continuously calculating the emissions that are being done for those trucks, and that's being done in a way according to the GLEC framework, based on the routes that they are actually doing. So that means that emissions data is really ready to be used for reporting in the format and on the frequency that is needed. So it really depends on what your customer actually wants, that the emissions data is available for you. So let's say you need to provide your emissions data alongside an invoice, then you can add those emissions to the invoice and immediately provide it to your customer. Or let's say they need that emissions data based on a weekly basis. They just need to check where we're at. Then you could, for example, create a custom CSV export directly from Qargo. Or in the case of Javier, which we'll see later, you can build out a full-fledged dashboard based on our Qargo data warehouse to really provide that with your own custom styling, the metrics that you are interested in, and reporting on the live data that is within the system, which is really, for me, the holy grail of the solution that you guys have built here. All right, but I said enough talking, and I'm still talking, so let's go to the screen to see Qargo in action. Can you see my screen, Javier?
Yeah, all is good to go.
Yes. All right. So here I have my Qargo environment available. And as I've mentioned, let's take a look at where the CO2 emissions are available within one order. So here I have my order 526, and I'm driving from Lotus Bakeries in Lembeek to the Hugo van der Goeslaan in Eindhoven. And I can check on my route immediately what the CO2 emissions are. So that's the little part that is over here. So I can see I am driving a van up to 3.5 tons gross vehicle weight, which is the category that we are using. And then you can see the emissions here. And immediately you can see that sum come into play. So the sum that I was talking earlier about, that is being calculated for each route. So you have the most granular data available to report according to the scope that you need. So we can see here the well-to-wheel emissions, which is 54.4 kilograms. And then we can see the well to tank and the tank to wheel as well, which is the sum there. So depending on how you would need to report, you can have those both available. And that is being calculated on an ongoing basis. So let's say I am not driving to Eindhoven, but I would be driving to Willem Biscuits in Eeklo. I can save and amend that delivery. And then we have to zoom in a little bit because now it's less far ahead. We have the new route, which is a lot less. Yeah. And we also see that, of course, we are also emitting a lot less, making a lot less emissions. That is also dependent on the type of vehicle that you're working with. So let's say I'm not driving around, I am driving around with a van, apparently, then we can change that as well. But if I go into the trip, and we're gonna check that one there.
Right on the top.
Resource here. Yeah. And we're not driving around with a van, but we're driving around with a semi-truck and a trailer. Or let's say this trailer. Assign the resources here. Oh, then we can see that immediately that the emissions that are being calculated are a lot higher than what we've had before with the van, which makes sense as well, because a semi-truck is, of course, going to transport a lot more goods as well. It's going to be able, it's up to 40 tons.
That comment right on top of the CO2. Whenever you had it before, you had the other category itself. And now whenever you change to the semi-truck, that's what it shows, a semi-truck of up to 40 tons. So that is immediately visible for the user live, the moment that you change something.
Yes. And the emissions categories that are being used for those resources is depending on the resources that have been configured in Qargo, and they all link back to the official GLEC data. So we always make sure that it's up to date for you. So you don't need to take into account, okay, it's going to be this amount of emissions for the kilometers that have been driven. The system all takes care of that for you. And especially since the framework evolves from an ongoing basis, I think now we're at version 3, it was version 2 a couple of years ago, then we definitely need to take that into account as well. So it's good that Qargo does that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, there is still even another cherry on top. Could you open the order, not the trip, for a second?
The trip?
Yeah, the order. Right on the
order,
on the top, yeah. Scroll up it. Yes, there we go. So at the moment, maybe the audience might not be realizing it because this is a specific trip. You are loading the entire time. But if you're dealing with containers or with many orders, it happens very often that you pick something empty, you drive somewhere else, you get loaded, and you finish up, right? So something very interesting that Qargo immediately provides, and you can see the difference right there on the route, is that the first line, it makes a differentiation between the amount of distance that you're actually driving empty versus when it is full. And this is absolutely key when later we're doing the intensity metrics, because when you're calculating the ton kilometer, you want to assume the amount of distance that weight actually traveled. It might not be the entire amount. And this is another example of the granularity of the data. Even if you're using model data or estimates, the way that they arranged it make it as much as possible that it can actually be reliable.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's really, that granularity together with the scopes of reporting that we can use to provide you, to support you in the use case that is needed. Now, of course, if we're calculating data, we also need to make them available into reports. So let's take a look at the ad hoc reporting ways that you can do this. So let's say I have my invoice. So I have my order 527 here that is already in the invoiced state. So I can check what the invoice is there. I think that's invoice 13 over here. Yeah, that's my 527. Then I can take a look at the invoice document that I have already prepared. And we can see that the CO2 emissions are over here. So you can see the well-to-wheel is 54.40 kilograms. But imagine that, we need to go into that more granular detail, and we want to add the tank-to-wheel or even the well-to-tank into that. We want to add in the little sum, then we can do that as well. So if I go into templates to see for document my invoice, then I can actually go and configure for that invoice and add that on the fly to ensure that I get that as well. So if I take my invoice over here, so then I can already immediately use that data as well. So it's gonna refresh here, yeah, and I have my emissions over here. You can go into here, see my emissions, but actually I want the little sum to arrive. Then I can say the tank to wheel would be the CO2. So the tank to wheel plus the what to tank, that would be the additional CO2 metrics. Now I need to take the right one. Yeah. And now we can see that little sum appearing over here as well. And we can immediately add that into our invoice. I can go into saving that template, go back to the invoice that I have, and then regenerate that one. Yep. And then wait a little bit until we have our PDF that has been documented, that has been created. You can see it's already downloaded. Oh, apologies, clicked it away. And now we can immediately see our updated invoice document ready to be sent to our customer.
I mean, frankly speaking, how many systems have we all seen in which you want to make any minor change for the user of something like a document? And it's an extreme headache to do absolutely anything. This is just another proof of the same, of how Qargo works. That's the whole idea. Yes. You don't need to know coding. You don't need to be technical of any kind. As long as you know what things are, and they are very easy to find, anybody can make the change.
Yes, with the right exactly. Place. Yes, and this is just an example of like the ongoing reporting that you can do. We can also say we want to go into the exports that we want to do. Yeah. So for example, I have my orders export here. No, not that one. I think, no, I want to edit this one. Yeah, I want to go into the orders export that I have over here. And here I've done the same with the well-to-wheel. Here we can do this. This would be a CSV or an Excel export. There's a Microsoft Excel export actually, and there we can do the same thing. I can also go to my CO2, add my tank to wheel. I can even aggregate or add the values that I want, and I can do that on an ongoing basis to then use that one for exporting multiple orders. So if I add that one over here. No, don't want an additional. Save that configuration. Whoop. And if I now go into my exports, so my Excel export, so I'm going to select a couple of rows, select the 2 orders that I have over here, export that. Whoop. Then I can actually open that one up if that wants to work. Well, and then we can immediately see the CO2 metrics that I've added over here. Yeah. So we can see the well-to-wheel that I've had before, and I can see the tank-to-wheel as well, and add upon that one later. So for example, if you need to provide all of the emissions that have been done on a weekly basis.
That's absolutely perfect. I mean, come on, you're just providing with an Excel with that, a simple pivot table trick.
Yeah, so exactly. Voila. I think for the application, that's going to be it. We can go further into the data warehouse, but yeah, I can bore you with some numbers on that. But I think there it's a lot more interesting to see what you've made, Javier.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Should I share the screen?
Yeah, you can start.
All right, perfect. All right, can you see the dashboard at the moment?
Not yet. Let me check. Yeah, here we are.
Yeah? All right. So essentially, guys, this is the general dashboard that we have made at Handico. I'm, of course, not going to open anything else at the moment, but for the sake of this webinar, we have anonymized the information from our clients so that you can actually see some real information live on how things are working out. So what we essentially envisioned was the following. We wanted to have a very easy dashboard that we can get any information regarding the CO2 that we want. We want to have easy access to the intensity emission metrics, and the best part of all, just the easy export for the client. As simple as clicking on this, I will say export and get exactly what I have. The client can receive it with as much transparency as possible. And what I'm going to show you now is exactly to what degree that transparency is. And it speaks to the granularity of the data that Qargo provides. So what we can see here is just for simple identification, of course, the order number that is internal to us. Next to that, we will immediately mention what we just talked about. Well to tank, tank to wheel, and then well to wheel with the entire life cycle. This one being the sum of these two. I will speak a bit later about the reduction of CO2 and what exactly that means. But after that, we're simply giving information on the kilometers, on the loaded kilometers, which is what we said before, that makes a big difference when talking about ton kilometer. Tons, the CO2 grams per ton kilometer, and of course the customer reference, so that when we provide it to them, they are able to match it to their own database and see that it's real, nothing out of it.
My Excel suddenly doesn't look so cool anymore compared to yours.
Well, that's because you haven't opened the BI log. That one looked great. Well, besides this, we also were thinking on the sense of the CO2 reduction should not only be about reporting, and that's it. Anybody can do reporting. The goal of it is also to improve. But obviously for improvement, the first step is being able to measure it, to know what you have. And that's where we stand. At the moment at Handico, our immediate reaction to trying to lower CO2 emissions was using the HVO fuel, which essentially gives an estimated reduction of CO2 of around 90%. That, of course, is not the long-term solution. The long-term solution is going to be different type of measures, such as electric trucks, for instance, et cetera, but that cannot be done in the short term as an immediate action. So what we thought of is that perhaps this can also be done to have an extra tools for sales, right? What we did here is simply this. If I click on this option, I'm going to get the list of every single order that has HVO included. As you see here, that's the total amount, regardless of what I have. That is where the reduction of CO2 comes into place, right? This is not the original. This is the calculated one, due to the fact that we have reduced this much out of making a 90% reduction of each of the independent topics. So what you can see here is that with 13 orders, there was essentially an 18,000 kilograms of CO2 saved with 13 orders. And that's what we believe, right? That whenever you talk to a client and you offer the options, one thing is to know it, that it gives you a CO2 reduction. Another thing is to see it. And
is to see it, yeah.
Exactly. It's entirely different. And as we said before, we're going now onto a landscape in which this matters, not just to us, but also to our clients. It is in everybody's interest to reduce their entire life cycle emissions. So perhaps by doing this and showing it more to clients and explaining what impact and potential reductions they will be able to get, we will also be able to increase our HVO providing efforts. Let's call it like that. And of course,
and it's crazy to see because 18,000 kilograms, that's like a full truck loaded with beer. I mean,
there you go. There you go.
I'd rather have a full truck loaded with beer than a full truck of emissions.
Tell me about it. But yeah, of course, you also see the effect on the metrics. I mean, once you're only looking at the HVO, and keep into account again that at the moment at Handico, what we built this with was with the estimated data, not with the primary data. And the reason why is simply because we primarily have at Handico 6 own trucks and a large amount of subcontractors working with us, which simply means there is no real impact on having all these 6 trucks with primary data when everybody else will have to be estimated. So in this sense, those efforts wouldn't really pay off, have a return on investment. But with other people, you could do exactly the same thing. You just put it together, match it one-to-one, and you will essentially have the same result.
Yeah. And in that sense, you're really a nice supplier of new transport orders because you are calculating the emissions for them, right?
There you go. We have even made an entire PDF, which I'm not going to go right now on. But essentially, we provide that document. It explains everything from how everything is calculated, what it comes from, what the deliverables that we provide are, and of course, some information about the HVO effect that it can have and how they will see it reflecting on their intensity metrics.
All right, cool. And how are your customers receiving that one?
So far, so good, frankly speaking. I mean, wait, let me see. Am I still sharing the screen? No, that's for you now.
No, I think that's me. I'll remove that one for a minute.
For the moment, great. We've had a few people that have been asking for the reports, whether that is possible on the first place. If it is, what does it consist of? Is it just a random document? Is it a CSV? What is this?
What is this based on?
There you go. But there is always a very, very positive reaction to whenever you show them a document like this that is not just a black box. It is an entirely transparent, auditable document that you can provide to them. Any question that they have, first, they can check it themselves with either their own customer references. And second, of course, they can come back to us. But as a company, it makes you feel just more reliable, safer, and excited to talk about it. Because you see the numbers, they make sense, they are reliable, there is nothing else behind it. And you can finally talk what you have and not the illusion of what could be.
Yeah. And I really noticed that when talking to you, like you're very confident in the CO2 emissions, which is something that when we started with Dialog a couple of years ago, you really noticed that everyone was looking in the room like, I have no clue on how to do this. I can't tell you how much I'm emitting. So it's really nice to see the staggering difference in a couple of years.
It really has been. I mean, on our previous system, we did have some sort of tool to calculate emissions. The only place in which they were provided, let's say, was like on the invoice. The same thing that you arranged, right? What was the problem? It was not like this. It was not that transparent. Let's say it like that. And the observable variables were, let's say, it was more an A to B result rather than an exhaustive calculation. So
I can imagine.
It is a difference. When you look at the paper and you talk about the number, now I know.
Given the trust there, it's the underlying data is reliable and it's built upon something structurally sound. I can imagine makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
All right, let's wrap this one up, shall we? Let me go back to the presentation. So thank you very much, Javier, already for showing us that dashboard. I'm really quite jealous of the dashboard right now. Perhaps some inspiration for ourselves for the future. So yeah, just to recap really there, it's really the emissions reporting, like Javier has mentioned, is just a lot more faster and a lot more accurate to be able to confidently express those emissions to customers, to provide them with the sound data that is there, so that they know, okay, this is a player that we really want to work with. And if they don't believe it, if Javier mentions it, then at least they can check the dashboard as well and check the data for themselves. Exactly right. Which really, just speaks measures on what your company has achieved there. So yeah, with that, I'll wrap this one up, Javier. Thanks for tuning in. So if you're an existing customer of Qargo, definitely go and try out our CO2 emissions feature. As I've mentioned to you, you can see it immediately in the orders and in the trip table. So it should be already available for you. If you want to include it into your PDF exports, your Excel exports, that can immediately be made available. But of course, you can also go all the way and work with the dashboard there. If you're a new customer and really interested in seeing what all of those emissions are about for yourself, then you can head to qargo.com and request a free demo there.
Yeah. And guys, if whether you're a Qargo customer at the moment or you aren't, if you are interested on any kind of review, advice, or question, feel free to reach us out. We'll be happy to show you around or the things that we've been able to do thanks to Qargo.
Yes. All right. Cool. Thanks a lot, Javier, for joining me today. And on to the next one.
A pleasure. Have a good day, guys.
Yes.